For a long time, blood testing has worked the same way. You go to a clinic. A needle goes into your vein. Vials are filled. Samples are sent to a lab. And days later, you get results. It's slow. It's uncomfortable. And for many people, it's intimidating. So when someone came along and said all of this could be replaced with a single drop of blood, people listened. The idea was simple, almost elegant. What if diagnostics worked like modern technology? Smaller devices, faster results, lower costs. What if healthcare finally caught up with Silicon Valley? That was the promise behind a startup called Theranos. At its peak, Theranos claimed it could run hundreds of medical tests from a finger prick. No needles, no waiting, just answers. The company said it would revolutionize medicine, expand access to healthcare, and save lives. And for a while, it seemed like it was working. By 2014, Theranos was valued at nearly $9 billion. Its founder, Elizabeth Holmes, appeared on magazine covers. World leaders praised her. Billionaires invested. Pharmacies rolled out testing centers to the public. To many people, this wasn't just a startup. It was the future. But behind the clean design, the confident interviews, and the carefully chosen words, there was a problem. The technology didn't work. Not the way it was promised. Not reliably. And not safely. What makes the Theranos story so unsettling isn't just that a company failed. Startups fail all the time. It's that so many smart, powerful, well-connected people believed in something that never actually existed. So how did that happen? How did a medical breakthrough that never worked convince investors, regulators, the media, and the public that it was real? Why were warnings ignored? And why did it take years for the truth to surface? To answer that, we need to do more than tell a story. We need to slow down and examine the evidence, the science, the psychology, and the systems that allowed belief to replace verification. Because Theranos wasn't just a lie told by one person. It was a story that a lot of people wanted to be true. And that's where this investigation begins. Elizabeth Holmes didn't look like a typical Silicon Valley founder. She didn't wear hoodies. She didn't talk fast. She didn't pitch aggressively. Instead, she spoke slowly, deliberately, often pausing between sentences. Her voice was low and controlled. Her appearance was simple, almost austere. That presentation mattered. Because long before Theranos was evaluated as a medical company, it was understood as a story. And the story began with Elizabeth Holmes herself. She was young. She was confident. And she spoke about healthcare as if it were personal. Holmes often said the idea for Theranos came from a fear of needles. She talked about watching people avoid blood tests, about how delayed diagnostics could cost lives. The problem she described was real. Anyone who has ever waited days for results knows that. And she framed her solution as moral, not just technical. This wasn't about disruption for disruption's sake. It was about access, about saving lives, about making medicine less painful and more humane. That framing was powerful, especially in a world already primed to celebrate founders who didn't just build companies, but claimed to fix broken systems. Holmes dropped out of Stanford at 19. That detail became part of the mythology. It echoed a familiar Silicon Valley narrative. The prodigy who leaves school because the idea is too important to wait. Investors recognized the pattern. The media recognized it too. And soon, the comparisons started. Steve Jobs. Holmes didn't push back against them. She leaned into them. The black turtlenecks. The minimalist language. The insistence on secrecy. Even the belief that vision mattered more than conventional expertise. In Silicon Valley, that mindset isn't unusual. Founders are often praised for ignoring skeptics, for moving fast, for believing in something before anyone else can see it. But medicine is not software. And that distinction rarely appeared in the early coverage. Instead, profiles focused on ambition, on confidence, on the idea that a single individual armed with intelligence and determination could outthink an entire industry. And to be clear, many people around Holmes genuinely believed in her. She recruited powerful allies, former secretaries of state, military leaders, senior politicians, people whose authority came not from medicine, but from influence. Their presence didn't validate the science, but it did validate the story. When someone like that joins a board, it sends a signal. Not that the technology has been proven, but that it must be important. That signal traveled quickly. Journalists repeated it. Investors echoed it. Partners assumed someone else had already done the due diligence. And slowly, without a single moment of confirmation, belief began to stack on top of belief. Theranos became less about whether the technology worked, and more about when it would change the world. That shift is subtle, but it's critical. Because once a founder is treated as a visionary, skepticism starts to look like cynicism. Doubt starts to feel like ignorance. And asking technical questions becomes socially uncomfortable, especially when the answers are always just out of reach. By the time Theranos reached its peak, Elizabeth Holmes wasn't just selling a product. She was selling certainty. And very few people stopped to ask the simplest question of all. What if the story was stronger than the science? Before we go any further, we need to pause for a moment. Because there's a question that almost no one asked at the height of Theranos' rise. Could this actually work? Blood testing isn't software. You can't launch a beta version and fix the bugs later. Every result depends on chemistry, and chemistry doesn't negotiate. Traditional blood tests use vials for a reason. Several milliliters of blood allow labs to separate plasma, control contamination, repeat measurements, and verify accuracy before results ever reach a patient. That process exists because errors in medicine don't just crash apps. They change lives. A finger prick produces only a fraction of that volume. When you reduce the sample, the margin for error doesn't shrink. It explodes. This isn't controversial. It isn't hindsight. Every trained lab scientist knows this. Small samples mean dilution. Dilution means weaker signals. Weaker signals make it harder to distinguish between what's real and what's noise. And that's just the first problem. Different blood tests require different conditions. Some need serum. Others require whole blood. Some demand strict temperature control. Others are sensitive to vibration, time, or light. Running hundreds of tests from the same tiny drop means making compromises. In medicine, compromises show up as false results. False negatives miss disease. False positives create panic. Theranos claimed it had solved all of this. They said their machine could run over 200 tests from a single drop of blood. Faster, cheaper, more accurate. But there was a catch. They never showed how. No peer-reviewed papers. No published validation studies. No independent verification from medical institutions. Instead, Theranos asked for trust. Trust in the box. Trust in the founder. Trust in the promise that something revolutionary was happening behind closed doors. That should have raised alarms. Because in healthcare, secrecy is not a competitive advantage. It's a liability. Medical breakthroughs are proven in public. They survive scrutiny. They invite replication. They expect questions. Theranos avoided all of that. When experts asked to see data, they were told the technology was proprietary. When partners asked how accuracy was maintained, they were reassured with confidence, not evidence. And confidence can be contagious, especially when it's backed by powerful names, glossy presentations, and a story everyone wants to believe. But belief doesn't make chemistry behave differently. You can't persuade molecules. You can't negotiate with biology. And no amount of vision changes the fundamental limits of physics. Still, the machine had a name, the Edison. It sat inside Theranos labs like a sealed oracle, rarely seen, never independently tested. Employees were told it worked. Investors were told it worked. Patients were told it worked. But very few people were ever allowed to ask the one question that mattered. Show us. And that silence is where this story begins to turn. Because when a company selling medical truth refuses to show its work, the danger isn't just financial. It's human. And behind the scenes, inside Theranos labs, The gap between the promise and the reality was already widening. For years, Theranos talked about transparency. Inside the company, it was the opposite. Employees didn't call it secrecy. They called it compartmentalization. Most people only saw a small piece of the operation. Engineers worked on one system. Lab technicians handled samples without knowing where the results came from. Software teams processed numbers they weren't allowed to question. No one was permitted to see the whole picture. That wasn't accidental. New hires signed aggressive non-disclosure agreements. Conversations were monitored. Emails were flagged. Badge access was restricted, even between coworkers sitting a few feet apart. If you asked too many questions, you didn't get answers. You got moved, or isolated, or fired. At the center of everything was the Edison machine. It was supposed to be the breakthrough, the device that made Theranos possible. But inside the labs, it struggled almost immediately. Fingerprick samples were too small, so they were diluted. Dilution made results unstable, so they failed quality checks. When tests didn't pass, they were rerun, and sometimes manually adjusted. This wasn't innovation. It was improvisation. For many tests, the Edison wasn't used at all. Instead, Theranos relied on commercial blood analyzers from Siemens. Machines designed for full vials of blood, not tiny samples. To make them work, Theranos modified the machines and diluted the samples anyway. That created another problem. Once you alter a medical device, you invalidate its regulatory approval. So Theranos didn't tell regulators, or investors, or partners. Internally, employees knew. They saw results that didn't make sense. Values that swung wildly between tests. Flags that should have triggered investigations, but instead triggered silence. Some tests were so unreliable that employees were instructed to void results and rerun them until something looked acceptable. Others were quietly discontinued without explanation. Patients were never told. Neither were doctors. And when problems surfaced, they weren't treated as scientific failures. They were treated as loyalty tests. If you raised concerns, you were accused of not understanding the vision. If you insisted, you were labeled a threat. Sunny Balwani, Theranos COO, enforced discipline through fear. Employees describe yelling, intimidation, and constant pressure to produce results that matched expectations. Elizabeth Holmes remained the comm center. She spoke about belief, about perseverance, about how revolutionary ideas are always misunderstood at first. To some employees, that confidence was reassuring. To others, it became terrifying, because belief was being used to override data, and data was being buried to protect belief. One employee, Tyler Schultz, joined Theranos hopeful. He was the grandson of George Schultz, a powerful board member. When Tyler saw test results being manipulated and quality controls ignored, he raised concerns internally. He was shut down. When he persisted, lawyers got involved. He left the company shaken, then watched as his own grandfather sided with the company over him. Another employee, Erica Chung, worked as a lab associate. She saw test failures firsthand. She watched as inaccurate results were sent to patients. She documented everything. Then she quit. Together, they did something few people inside Theranos dared to do. They spoke to the outside world. Not because they wanted attention, but because they believed people could get hurt. And by the time they stepped forward, the damage was already spreading beyond the lab. For a long time, Theranos controlled the narrative. When journalists called, they were offered polished interviews. When critics appeared, they were dismissed as uninformed or biased. When questions surfaced, they were buried under confidence. But eventually, the story reached someone who didn't want access. He wanted proof. John Carreyrou was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. He had covered finance and healthcare long enough to recognize when something didn't add up. In 2015, he received a tip. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't detailed. It was just enough to raise a question. So he started asking. Theranos refused to engage. They sent lawyers instead. Legal threats, cease and desist letters, warnings that publishing would lead to lawsuits. For many newsrooms, that pressure works. For Kuriru, it was confirmation. He tracked down former employees. He cross-checked their stories. He asked for documents. He looked for inconsistencies. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The Edison didn't run most tests. Commercial machines were doing the work. Accuracy problems were widespread. Patients had been put at risk. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published the first article. It was restrained, careful, devastating. Theranos denied everything. Elizabeth Holmes went on television, calm and unshaken. She framed the reporting as an attack on innovation. She suggested that critics were uncomfortable with change. But something had shifted. This time, the story didn't disappear. More articles followed. More sources came forward. Regulators began asking questions. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspected Theranos labs. What they found wasn't ambiguous. They cited serious deficiencies, failures in quality control, practices that posed immediate jeopardy to patient health. In 2016, regulators voided tens of thousands of test results. Patients were told their results might be wrong. Some had been falsely reassured. Others had been falsely alarmed. Theranos was barred from operating a lab. Elizabeth Holmes was banned from owning one. Partnerships collapsed. Walgreens shut down Theranos wellness centers. Insurance providers walked away. The valuation didn't decline gradually. It fell off a cliff. Investors who once praised Holmes stopped returning calls. The board resigned quietly, and the company that had once promised to change medicine struggled to explain how it had operated at all. Still, the question remained. Was this failure, or was it fraud? That answer would take years to arrive. In 2018, the story of Theranos stopped being about innovation. It became about accountability. Federal prosecutors charged Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani with wire fraud and conspiracy. The accusation was simple and devastating. They had raised hundreds of millions of dollars by knowingly lying about what their technology could do. Holmes stepped down as CEO. Theranos dissolved not long after. But the real reckoning was still ahead. Trials move slowly. Evidence is methodical. And unlike the world of startups, charisma doesn't matter once testimony begins. Holmes' trial started in 2021. For the first time, investors testified under oath about what they were told behind closed doors. They described demos that suggested real-time testing when results had actually been prepared in advance. Claims about military contracts that never existed. Accuracy rates that were never proven. Emails were entered into evidence. Internal documents. Messages that contradicted public statements. The defense argued belief. Holmes didn't deny that the technology failed. She argued that failure wasn't fraud. That she believed Theranos would eventually succeed. That she trusted her team. That she was misled by Balwani. It was a familiar argument in Silicon Valley. The difference was context. This wasn't an app that launched too early. It was a medical company delivering diagnostic results to real patients. Prosecutors didn't need to prove that Holmes wanted people harmed. They needed to prove she knew the claims were false when she made them. The jury deliberated for days. In January 2022, they reached a verdict. Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of wire fraud related to investors. She was acquitted on charges tied directly to patients. The distinction mattered legally, but morally the damage was already clear. She was sentenced later that year to more than 11 years in federal prison. Sunny Balwani's trial followed. Prosecutors painted a clearer picture of internal control, of pressure, of intimidation, of knowledge. Balwani was convicted on all counts. Nearly 13 years. Appeals followed. They failed. By 2025, both sentences stood. The Silicon Valley myth had reached its endpoint. Not with a pivot. Not with an acquisition. But with prison terms. Still, even after convictions, some questions lingered. How did this happen for so long? Why were warnings ignored? And why did so many intelligent people suspend disbelief? To answer that, we have to step back. Because Theranos wasn't just a story about one company. It was a story about an ecosystem. Theranos didn't succeed because people were foolish. It succeeded because the system rewarded belief over verification. Investors didn't ignore red flags because they were careless. Many of them believed they were backing something historic. Something that would be studied the way we study the early days of Apple or Google. They trusted the signals. A confident founder, powerful board, prestigious media coverage, partnerships with household names. Each one acted as proof of legitimacy. But none of them tested the blood. That's the first lesson. In industries where lives are at stake, storytelling is not validation. Healthcare doesn't care how compelling a founder sounds. Biology doesn't respond to confidence. And no amount of ambition changes the laws of chemistry. The second lesson is about secrecy. Theranos treated transparency as a threat. But in medicine, transparency is a safeguard. Peer review exists for a reason. Independent validation exists because even honest teams can miss their own errors. When a company asks you to trust the technology without showing the evidence, it isn't protecting innovation. It's asking for permission to avoid accountability. The third lesson is cultural. Silicon Valley celebrates disruption. It praises founders who move fast, break rules, and ignore skeptics. That mindset works when you're building software. It becomes dangerous when you're handling human health. Fake it till you make it may win pitch competitions. But when applied to diagnostics, it crosses a line. Because the cost of being wrong isn't inconvenience. It's harm. And then there are the whistleblowers. Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung weren't trying to take down a company. They weren't chasing fame. They tried to fix problems internally first. When that failed, they spoke out. They paid a price for it. Legal threats, professional risk, personal stress. Without them, this story might never have surfaced. Every system that discourages whistleblowing eventually protects the wrong people. And finally, there's the hardest lesson. Theranos didn't collapse because one person lied. It collapsed because many people chose not to look too closely. They wanted the future to arrive faster. They wanted the story to be true. And wanting something badly enough can feel a lot like believing it. Until reality intervenes. Theranos is often remembered as a fraud. But it's more accurate to see it as a warning. About what happens when ambition outruns evidence. About what happens when skepticism is treated as hostility. And about what happens when we confuse confidence with competence. Because the most dangerous part of this story isn't that it happened. It's that it could happen again. If you value stories that slow things down, question the narrative, and follow the evidence all the way to the end, consider subscribing. We release deep investigative breakdowns like this regularly. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next autopsy.